Morning. We'll go ahead and begin class this morning. We'll take a seat. I'm excited to be able to be with you this morning and teach this auditorium class. It's not often that I get to get out of the college ministry hole in there and come and see everybody else in classes and stuff. And so I'm always excited to get to do so when I can. This summer, we're going to be covering 1 Timothy. And on the screen I have 2 Timothy. Will we get to 2 Timothy? Who knows? We'll see when we get there. But last time I taught in the summer, we went through Mark. It's for some of you who are in here. And several people said, I really wish you would just cover the whole chapter and not go so slow and skip so much stuff. And so here's my compromise. We're going to do a shorter letter. And if we get to the second letter, then we get to the second letter. But we're going to go through 1 Timothy and just cover as much as we can as we go. And by the end of it, if nothing else, you'll know 1 Timothy really well, I hope, as will I. Today's just going to be kind of let's lay our foundation for 1 Timothy, prep ourselves for this coming up summer of studying 1 and maybe 2 Timothy. And so we're going to establish some context of the letter, and that's where we're really going to spend most of our time. And then we'll get into kind of the purpose or the content of the letter, and then what we expect to glean from it as people at Dalrata. Now this class, just to preface, this particular class is probably going to be a bit more of a lecture. You're welcome to raise your hand and make a comment if you'd like. But for right now, I'm just going to throw out some information, talk through some things about what we need to know before we really dig in to this study. Now, I don't really intend for every class to be this way because I don't prefer to just talk the whole time. And so when we get into the text, we'll have a little bit more discussion, and I'll open some things up to questions, and we'll see how it goes. But for right now, for this class, we're going to just lay a foundation first, and then the classes to come. The plan will be, in the classes to come, to walk through the text together. We'll go a few verses at a time. However far we get is how far we get. And so going by verse, we're going to try to think, if I'm Timothy and I've received this letter, how am I taking this? What am I thinking? How does this apply to my situation? And once we get that down, then we can say, all right, now what do we learn? How can we apply this to ourselves? Okay? And so that is actually why we start with context, and we'll get to this slide in just a second. Why is this stuff important? Okay, why is this whole context, why is it important? We're about to get into the weeds a little bit. We're about to kind of dig into some this person, that person stuff just for a little while. And just so that we can know kind of what we're talking about here. And the reason that we're doing this is if we're going to understand the content of 1 Timothy, and especially maybe there's some little sections of 1 Timothy that are a little harder to understand than others. If we're going to understand those things, then we need to know what is happening in the lives of Paul and of Timothy. We need to know what Ephesus is like and what they're struggling with. And so really, I think that there's no point in studying this book for a whole quarter, a whole summer, if we're not first going to make sure we know what we're talking about. What's happening in the letter of 1 Timothy that is going to give us the ability to say, well, we know that Paul is saying this because this is what's happening in the life of Timothy or in Ephesus, and this is important to know. So, first we're going to start with Paul, or authorship, okay? Who wrote 1 Timothy? Now, this is probably pretty obvious to you. It's Paul. How do we know it's Paul? Well, there's a very obvious 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 1, where he says, Paul, the apostle, he writes this letter. Now, on top of that, and for us, let's preface. For us, that's all we need. We see that Paul says he wrote it. We say Paul must have written it. That's all we need to know. But what we're going to see in a second is some people would disagree. And so we need to probably set up some things before we get to the people who like to not agree. And so, one, the letter claims it. That's enough for us, but let's keep going. Also, we have what we call church tradition. We've got some people who were very early on. You see on the screen, like Clement of Rome. He was known as someone who knew Paul personally, according to, I think, Eusebius. And he says, he writes some things in First Clement, chapter 5, verses like 1 through 7, that are reminiscent or similar to what we see from Paul's writings in First Timothy and in Titus. And all that tells us is these letters were known in the time of Clement of Rome. It's also assumed that Clement knew Paul personally and that he was an elder of Rome, according to Eusebius, who's a 4th century historian, but it's at least something, right? What we get from this is, all right, Clement of Rome, very early on, seems to know about these letters. Like, these letters were already written, okay, with First Timothy. And I guess that's to preface with, a lot of this will apply to First Timothy, but it will also apply to 2 Timothy and Titus, because they're all considered kind of grouped together in Paul's letters as pastoral epistles, where Paul is guiding a specific person on how to minister where they are, either Timothy or Titus. And so they're kind of unique in that way, and we'll get there in a little while. So we know that these letters were kind of already known. Polycarp, who is considered to be like maybe not a disciple of the Apostle John, but he's very close to the Apostle John and learned under the Apostle John, according to a couple different sources. Polycarp quotes and references 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 7 and 10, specifically in one of his letters to the Philippians. And so that is really good evidence that this has already existed. This letter to 1 Timothy has already existed. Well, we also get some other guys, Irenaeus on here. He calls the writer of 1 Timothy the apostle in one of his writings. We also get this thing up here, the Moratorian, I think that's how you say it, canon. And I had no idea what this was. You really don't have to. It's just kind of extra evidence for you if you want it. It's this Latin list of New Testament books that they put together, drawn up in Rome at the end of the 2nd century, and they already knew about 1 Timothy. So 1 Timothy was in this little canon here. And so all that tells us, all of this, is telling us this letter to 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy and Titus, they were all known very early on, and they continued to be seen throughout these really early years where Paul would have written the letter. So there's some real evidence that we can give for that. Now, Pauline authorship was pretty universally accepted until like the 18th to 19th century, when these German guys with weird names said, we actually know better than like everybody else ever. And so we're going to say that Paul didn't write the letter. And so what they do is they go and they pick apart some specific things. And I think the strongest argument I could find was based on vocabulary, the words that Paul actually uses. So they pick apart a few different things. I think this is their best argument. And after this, we're going to say why this is also still wrong. But these parts are facts. Okay, so this one guy, P.N. Harrison, he published his study in like 1912 in Oxford, and he basically just goes through, here's all the problems of the pastoral epistles, right? 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And he gets to all these different words, and like this is the weeds part I was talking about, and we're gonna lift our way out of it here in a little while. But he goes through all these words, okay? So he says there's X number of words, 848. Different words that Paul uses in the pastoral epistles in all 3 letters. Now we're talking about each word is like a specific different word, okay? So there's 848 words that aren't proper names, and 306 of them, about a third of them, don't occur in any of Paul's 10 other letters. And so what this guy is trying to make the point of is all 3 of these letters are so different than the rest of Paul's letters, and you can see it in that 306 of these words aren't even used in the rest of Paul's letters that we know for sure are Paul's. And so we assume this is not Paul's work here, these 3 letters. And they even go on to say that 175 of these 306 words aren't used anywhere in the New Testament. So they're like, nobody in this little 1st century area are using these 175 of these words. And so they also look at some words that are kind of specifically Paul uses in a specific way. Like he would use this word, and we would say, oh, this sounds like Paul because Paul uses this word in this way. Well, in these letters, these words are used, but they're used a little differently, and it doesn't seem as much like Paul. Okay, so they'll say that. And instead, they'll also say, along with a few other factors about style and stuff, they'll say, well, we have some writings in the 2nd century that are pretty similar. And so, as a result, all these letters must come from the 2nd century, way after Paul, well, pretty fair amount after Paul, and it can't be Paul. And at first, when you see all of these numbers, at least when I saw all these numbers and stuff, and this happens to me every time I read some objection from however long ago that I've never heard before, I think, oh man, those are pretty good points. I don't really know how to combat that. So it might lead you to the question of, did Paul write it? Should it be included in our Bible? And surprise, surprise, I think the answer is yes, Paul did write it, and it should be included in our Scripture. So how do we combat all of these numbers and stuff up here? Defense. Generally put, Paul's a pretty smart guy. And so here's how that, I think, translates. Words that are, some of the words, remember, that we talked about, they were abnormal for Paul to use, and they were more commonly used in the 2nd century. That was one of their arguments, right? Well, a lot of these words that were like, oh, those are 2nd century words, couldn't be Paul, are seen like before 50 AD. And so Paul could have very well, and I would assume is, because we believe that Paul wrote this letter, he's familiar with these words, okay? So this is not like, Paul couldn't have known these words. They're only ever used in the 2nd century. Not true, okay? So we have evidence of them being used earlier. We also can assume that Paul was aware of more words than he used in his letters, which is kind of a given, right? You would think. He uses, in all of his letters, in the other 10, he uses 2,177 different words. And so of those words in the other 10 letters, you can just ask, don't you think that he would know 306 more? The 306 that are so different from Paul's writings, it can't be Paul. How could Paul know 300-something words extra? Okay, well, we can kind of assume Paul's a smart guy. He's well-educated. He's got a big vocabulary. Probably knows a lot of words, maybe even more than 2,177, okay? And so that's not really a great argument either. And also, we have to factor in here that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are all written to a specific person. It's a different audience than usual. Usually it's like to Ephesians or to Galatians or to the church in Rome or something like that. Well, this is to Timothy or to Titus. And so you're getting a different audience. You're getting a different purpose and context. And so you're going to get different words pretty naturally, I think. Okay, so all these word things are you can kind of dismiss them. Now, over the decades, this was 1921 that this guy made this study and whatnot. Over the decades, people have said, hey, this is a good study, let's make it better. And they make it more complicated, as scholarship always does, and they continue to expand on stuff that was already done in the past. But I think you can just keep going back to these points. Paul's a smart guy. He's got a big vocabulary. He probably can write a lot of different words. And so we can still pretty much assume that this is Paul. Well, we can know that this is Paul. We don't really assume. Now, that's just the best argument that I think that they have. They have some more. None of them are very good. We're going to take the Bible, what it says, and say, Paul wrote it. All right. Now let's talk about the date and the place of writing. Now this is one that is a lot harder to nail down. Actually, so much so that you can't really say this is exactly when it happened and where. One thing to keep in mind, and this is something that as I read, I was like, I should probably keep this in mind myself as I'm writing this class and studying and stuff, is we don't know every single thing that Paul did. Like, the book of Acts this is every single breath that Paul took, and every single place he traveled, and every single person he visited. We don't have that, okay? And so we don't know every single place he traveled. We don't know all the people he visited. We don't know when he was, the list in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, where he says, I was frequently imprisoned, I was beaten 5 times by the Jews, I was shipwrecked 3 times, etc. We don't know exactly when and where all of those things happened. We just know that they happened because Paul said so. And we don't really know for certain when he died even. And this is something that I actually said, if you remember, just a couple of weeks ago when we read through Acts. I was like, all right, Paul is going to be imprisoned in Rome, and then very shortly after chapter 28 of Acts, he's going to die. And then the more I studied, the more I was like, I don't really know if that's the case. I don't know why I ever assumed that, because there could be other options. And so let's go through that together. We're going to work through some of these kind of ideas of like when it was written and where it might have been written, so that we can know what's happening with Paul at this point. And I think if we can nail down, or at least at least talk about this date and when it was written, we can maybe have a better idea of what's happening in Ephesus, and then we'll go from there in context and stuff. So here's some options of when it could have been written. I'll give you two. The first one is it could have been written within the confines of what we know. And so what I mean by that is like within Acts, we can maybe point out some places where Paul could have written these letters. Okay, so some people will say that the letter was written in the time when Paul had left Ephesus and went to Macedonia. And so that would be Acts chapter 20, verse 1, where at the end of Acts chapter 19, he talks to the Ephesian elders. He says farewell to them, gives them some warnings. And in Acts chapter 20, verse 1, he leaves to go to Macedonia. And in this hypothesis, if you want to call it that, the timeline would look something like Paul, Timothy, and Titus travel to Crete, and Titus is assigned to stay there. Now, we don't really have that. We just know that at some point that happened because Paul talks about it when he writes to Titus. And so then Paul leaves with Timothy, and they go to Ephesus for 2 or 3 years. That's chapters like 17 through 19, I think. They're there for a while. Lots happen that we get to read about. And then Paul says, remain here in Ephesus and work with this church. And then in chapter 20, verse 1, Paul leaves and he goes to Macedonia. And then people assume that he writes while he's traveling around Macedonia. In this case, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, which basically says, like, at some point, Paul left Timothy while in Ephesus and went to Macedonia. So that gives us a pretty good tie of like, well, it could be Acts chapter 20, verse 1. We could be looking at it right here. If we read 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, where this happens, we're going to assume that it's a past event, and we're going to place it in Acts chapter 20, verse 1, where Paul says, I'm leaving Ephesus, I'm going to Macedonia. And then he does. And that's where we're going to say he's going to write it. And so if that's true, then we're looking at this letter around like 57 AD and writing shortly afterward, so in this ballpark. Now, I should preface with a lot of these dates, even with like how old Polycarp and all that stuff was, are kind of fuzzy. And so I'm going to put up there something like 57 AD, but it could be kind of a general within a year or two of that. So I don't want to say anything's concrete or set in stone there. Second option is that it was written after Paul's first imprisonment and before the second. And so what we have is the first one, the end of Acts, where he is imprisoned in Rome. We have that one recorded, but some people at least will point out that it doesn't really look like Paul's about to be executed. And I think that's kind of valid. You've got Festus and Agrippa in Acts 25 and 26, who both say, it's not really a case against this guy. Like, we can't really figure, there's no reason to execute him. And so much so, this is believed that Paul's allowed to live in this house by himself with a guard, and Jewish leaders and stuff are able to come in, and Paul's able to continue to teach. He's able to rent a home. And so he doesn't seem like someone who's on death row, right? Like, he doesn't seem like he's about to die. This is further kind of talked about by Clement of Rome. Remember, very super early on, he writes this letter, 1 Clement, chapter 5, verse 7, and he says that Paul reached the outer limits of the West. Okay, so that we assume is Spain. Not everybody believes that, but a lot of people do. In Romans chapter 15, verse 24, Paul says one of his goals is eventually to get to Spain after he drops off the collection in Rome, the collection in Jerusalem. He's been like kind of gathering this whole time. He talks about that in 2 Corinthians and in other places, that he's got this collection he's going to bring to the church in Jerusalem because they're really struggling. And so in Romans chapter 15, he says, I'm going to bring that collection to Jerusalem, and then my goal is to get to Spain. And he gets imprisoned before he can make it there. Okay, and so 1 Clement, chapter 5, verse 7, which I should remind you, is not like some inspired text. It's just a guy from the first century who writes these things down to a church. Now, he's very early on. He's super, super close to Paul, much closer than we are. And so we kind of take his word for some, there could be some real information here, but maybe he's wrong about some things. Okay, so I guess I should preface when I use church fathers, I should preface in that way. But Clement says he made it to Spain, it seems like. Okay, so And if this is true, we're going to look at 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, where he says, I left you in Ephesus and I went to Macedonia. And we're going to look at that as something we don't have recorded, where at some point Paul assigns to Timothy Ephesus, and then he leaves to go to Macedonia. Date-wise, if Paul's first imprisonment was around 59 to 61 AD, then we're probably looking at 1 Timothy in the ballpark of like 62 to 65. And this also places his death under Nero after the Great Fire, if you remember, where this fire happened, and Nero is like, let me pin it on the Christians, and then he persecutes Christians really badly. And so then we would say he probably died around 68. Clement also kind of attests to that with him, Paul, and Peter. So, okay, all right, let's get out of the weeds a little bit. This is more of like some stuff that we can be pretty positive about. We're going to say, no, we're not going to say, we know it was written to Timothy. Because we've already established earlier, we know that that 1 Timothy is written by Paul, it is inspired text. And so because of that, we're going to take it for what it says. And in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 2 says, it's written to Timothy. One thing I forgot about teaching in this room is that the later it goes, the more the sun hits my face in that window up there. So I'm going to start inching my way forward because I'm a little bit blind right now. Let's see. All right, here's some things we know about Timothy. We need to know who is being written to. Well, one is that he's from Lystra in Galatia. This is a place that Paul has already visited in Acts chapter 16. I think something really cool about Timothy is that even as a young man, he's very well respected by the church here. We can't really be certain how old he was. We just know that he was young and that the church respected him. He had a good reputation. And I think that this tells us a lot about Timothy's faith and his zeal, his integrity as a Christian, even as a young man. And so that at a young age, he still had a good reputation in the church. And, this is speculation, okay? This is Nate version here, if you want to call it that. But I wonder if the church at Lystra just saw the opportunity for Timothy to do amazing things in the kingdom with Paul, and then just took that opportunity to talk really highly of him to Paul. Like, oh, Paul's coming. Let's talk to him about Timothy. See if they will, if Paul will agree to take Timothy. And maybe that's not recorded. Maybe that's not the case. But I would imagine there's either two options here. One, Paul goes to Lystra, and all these people just so happen to talk really highly about Timothy, and then Paul says, I should bring Timothy with me. Or the church says, Paul's coming. Let's talk really highly about Timothy and see if Timothy will have the opportunity to go with Paul, because he could do such amazing things in the kingdom, and then that's what happens. I don't know. But either way, we see that he really has a high standing in the church, if not necessarily in position, but in reputation. That he is really well respected. We also know that his mother, Eunice, was a Christian, but she was Jewish. His grandmother, Lois, was also a Christian. We see that in 2 Timothy, actually, in chapter 1, verse 5. And his father was Greek, or Gentile, and so it was assumed that he is not a Christian, though I guess we know that for absolute 100% certain. If any of you, however, lived, we're trying to figure out maybe what can we know about Timothy and what can we, we're learning about Timothy so that we can maybe learn why Paul writes certain things, how he's going to understand certain things. So if you grew up maybe in a household where there was only one parent who was a Christian, especially a mother, maybe you understand a little bit about where Timothy's coming from with his faith and his beliefs. Okay, and I don't necessarily know exactly all what that means, but you can maybe relate in some ways to Timothy. Now let's talk about their relationship, Paul and Timothy's relationship. In Acts chapter 16, verses 1 and 2, that's where we see that Paul chooses Timothy as a co-worker. And I don't think that Paul choosing someone as a co-worker is taken lightly or something that is kind of like, we just don't see it happen often. Okay, if you're going to go work with Paul, Paul's got to respect you. And not just a respect of like, you're my brothers and sisters and I respect you in that way, but like, you've got to be someone who's going to work in the kingdom. You got to be someone who's really willing to put your personal interests aside because of the life you're about to live running with Paul, and you're willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that the gospel is taught. And so we've already seen, if you remember in Acts, I think at the end of chapter 15, where John Mark tries to go on another mission trip with Paul after he has already abandoned him in one time. And Paul says, no, I'm not taking you again. You already left me once. I'm not going to take you again. And that's reconciled later in Acts. But what we see from that is Paul's serious about who goes with him. Paul is not going to, I don't know if this may be the right term to use, but he's not going to bring around dead weight. He's not going to bring someone that doesn't want to work, that doesn't care about what's happening, that isn't willing to put themselves aside for the sake of the gospel. And he sees these qualities in Timothy. So he chooses him. In Acts chapter 16, verse 3, we see that Paul is able to really see Timothy's dedication. Okay, so in Acts chapter 16, verse 3, it says that Paul circumcises Timothy so that Timothy could also teach the Jews. Because Timothy's dad was a Greek. There was probably no reason for Timothy to be circumcised because Gentiles didn't do that. There was no need for it. And really, we've already talked about this in Acts 15, that there's no need for that in the church now. It's not required to be in the new covenant, only the old. Okay, and so it's not necessary. But it is necessary to make sure you can reach the Jews. And so what we see is in verses 1 and 2, Paul chooses Timothy. And then in the next verse, verse 3, Timothy decides to do this. And so Paul circumcises him. Well, what does that tell us about Timothy? His devotion to teaching the gospel, or at least having the ability to teach the gospel to people he may not have reached. You know, I can't imagine that this is something that Timothy preferred, but his desire to be effective among all people was greater than his preference. You know, and Paul describes his own mentality in himself in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19, 18, really through like verse 23. Paul describes this of himself, where he says, you know, I became a Jew to the Jews so I could teach the Jews. I became all things to all men so that by all means I might save some. His goal is to do whatever he can, whatever is within the boundaries of Scripture to teach. And if that means, it means being circumcised so that I can make sure I'll reach the Jews, that's what I'm going to do. So Paul already has this mentality. Well, we get Timothy in verses 1 through 2, who is chosen and well respected among the church, in verse 3, saying, I'm willing to do that too. That's who I'm willing to be. And so this mentality that Paul already has is enacted by Timothy here in Acts chapter 16. So for Paul, what does that tell Paul about Timothy here? And maybe this is something Paul already knew about Timothy. He's already figured it out pretty early. But what this decision informs us and Paul about Timothy is that Timothy is willing to put himself aside for the sake of the gospel. And it's a necessary quality for all Christians to have, but especially men who are going to live their lives as Paul lived. It is imperative. It is a necessity that this is who you are and the mentality you have, and that is what Timothy had. We also know about the relationship that Paul's descriptions for Timothy, we can see how close they are in how Paul describes Timothy as my beloved and faithful child in the Lord, 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. And my true child in the faith, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 2. Shows us how much Timothy is cared for by Paul. Now, it is not necessarily uncommon. You see it in John, you see it in Paul, and I believe in Peter too, where people are called brothers and sisters. Paul has even called other people children in the faith, in that Paul brought the gospel to them. He may have began the church in a certain, or started the church in a certain area, and so he might call them his beloved or his children in the faith. But none of them really get this kind of description that Timothy gets. My beloved and faithful child in the Lord, my true child in the faith. And what I think we see with that is how close they are and how much Paul loves Timothy, mentoring Timothy. You see a pretty intimate connection here that Paul might not really have with anybody else that he works with, I think. It just based on the way that Paul talks to Timothy and the titles that Timothy is given. And I wonder if Paul had ever just saw some of himself in Timothy. And I wonder if Paul ever just, one of the reasons that they were so close is if he just saw how much Timothy was like Paul. And maybe not. Maybe it's just strictly kind of the bond, the common love of the gospel that bonded them so closely. That could be it. And their dedication to getting it to all people, regardless of the cost of their own. Maybe that's it. Or maybe it's a combination of it all. But for some reason, and I think we have plenty of reasons to see, they were very, very close. We see Paul write lovingly to many, but this relationship between Paul and Timothy is special. And that's important to know, so that when we get into 1 Timothy, you see some specific instructions, some that maybe if you received from a stranger, you would think, well, why are you talking to me like that? Or why would you give me these kind of warnings or whatever? We see how close Paul is in that he knows Timothy's youth. He knows the challenges he's going to face, not only because of Ephesus, but also because of his youth. We know that Paul knows Timothy's temperament, his personality, and the specific challenges that Timothy will face, even his health. And we know the specific challenges that Timothy will face, Paul does. So he's able to write some really personal instructions in this letter that I think that we'll bring out, as we get there. And we also see that Timothy traveled with Paul a lot. We know that they traveled to Macedonia and Greece and Corinth and Ephesus together, and potentially several other places. We get some of that in Acts and further. So this is something important to talk about, is Ephesus. Timothy is in Ephesus when he receives the letter, chapter 1, verse 3. And this is where he is remaining to work in the church. So we probably should talk about what we know about Ephesus. Okay, so Ephesus was established around 1100 BC, so it's very old. It is. Okay, I was a little worried that y'all wouldn't be able to see that, but I think it came out okay. It came well before Christianity was a thing in the 80s. It was well before. Ephesus is an old city. And so Ephesus is known to be founded by some Asians, specifically Amazons, okay? And then Greece kind of came and took it over. And so the Greeks kind of made it their own, and they were known for two main things. One was worshiping Artemis, and two, and this is they're both pretty big. I don't know if I'd say one is a main thing, but worshiping Artemis, and the fact that they were so close to a port. So Ephesus is just a handful of miles away from the water, and so there's a port right there nearby. And so the strategic harbor that they had and their Artemis worship resulted in Ephesus becoming a very prominent and wealthy city before Christianity. And so what we see is a little bit later on in the when I guess the whole Pax Romana thing for anyone who's a history person, when it was being established and created by Augustus and whatnot, Augustus came into Ephesus, brought it there, and then established Ephesus as like a capital in the province. And so Augustus saw the value of Ephesus, how big it was, and its potential to grow, and he made it a capital. And so around Paul's time, we're looking at 100,000 people in Ephesus and a booming economy. It's a very robust economy in Ephesus. So these people are comfortable and wealthy, and there's a lot of them. Ephesus was kind of known within the city for their theater, building-wise, okay? They've got a big theater that we read about in Acts chapter 19, and the Temple of Artemis. Now, the Temple of Artemis is a big deal, both metaphorically and in the fact that it was considered the biggest ancient building ever in the world. And so the Temple of Artemis, it predates the 4th century BCE, so it's very old. It was known as the largest building in the ancient times. And how it was used was it formed the center of their civic and religious life. And so a lot of economical things were happening in there, but it was also a very, very big deal for their religious lives. And we kind of see that in Acts chapter 19, as Paul, I believe, is kind of in that courtyard of the Temple of Artemis. So the Temple of Artemis is a chief symbol of their identity. It is incredibly important to who they are that they have this huge, amazing, grand Temple of Artemis and that they worship Artemis. Now, I think it's ironic maybe that if you look at maybe what pictures of the Temple of Artemis would have looked like versus what it looks like now, vastly different. Mainly because it doesn't hardly even exist anymore. There's like, it would have been from about here to here, which is ginormous when you look at it. But there's like nothing standing of it. And so it used to be really cool. Now it's just a cool thought. What we also know about religious life in Ephesus is that there was some emperor worship. They just worshiped the emperor, mostly or especially because they were an imperial capital. And so it was a big deal for people to worship the emperor as well. They dabbled in their own magic and sorcery and soothsaying and whatnot. They kind of took part in that, and they were known for that. And so in case you couldn't have guessed, all these factors, they were comfortable, there was a whole bunch of people, they were wealthy, they worshipped Artemis, and they worshipped the emperor, and they dabbled in their own magic and sorcery and whatnot. With all these factors, you could probably imagine that there are some major cultural issues in Ephesus. And because there are major cultural issues in Ephesus, there are issues in the church. Because how often, and do we see this even today, does the culture that we're in impact the church, whether it should or shouldn't? Okay? And I would say for pretty much all the time, it shouldn't. It really shouldn't. But it does. And so how do we see that it happens in Ephesus? Well, there's a big movement that I think we're going to see, and it's especially involving Ephesian women. I think that this is maybe why in 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3, he talks about wives or women who are abstaining from marriage and widows who have kind of turned to Satan in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 15. And so we have a other discussion about women, like in chapter 2, verses 9 through 15, that we'll get to. We'll get to all of that later on. But I think all of this kind of discussion about women and what's happening is linked to this cultural movement amongst women in Ephesus. And so what's happening is that these wealthy women, supported by maybe influential philosophers or teachers, they are being taught certain things, and this is what, as a result, they are doing. Okay, so one is they're throwing off the dress code. And this is not like what we're talking about with dress code is not like in the church, your shorts need to come to the knee kind of dress code. We're talking about just in culture, how would women dress as seen acceptably, and how would they not? And so what's happening is, so their dress code kind of represented like respectability and sexual modesty, fidelity to one's husband. And so they're dressing in such a way as to reject this entirely, all of those things. So they're trying to portray themselves as disrespectful and adulterous before others. These women who are buying into this movement here are kind of exploring and acquiring different sexual liaisons, different partners. And they're doing so through dinner parties and banquets. And then they're aborting children and doing really bad things because children are going to slow them down. And so they can't live this lifestyle with the children they have. It's very bad, okay, all bad things. They're also taking an active role in public life. They're speaking up, not only in the worship assembly, as we're going to see in chapter 2, but they're also just speaking up in the public life and in politics, in the presence of men and of their husbands. While not every woman was influenced by this culture, and not every woman who was influenced by this culture took part in all of these specific things, this was the movement, okay? And it was called the New Roman Woman, was the idea. And it encouraged just the rejection of the status quo, what culture saw to be acceptable, reject all of those things, do this instead. And so we see women in Corinth and in Ephesus kind of succumb to this influence. And Paul notes that risking being seen in this way is also going to affect your ability to tell people about the gospel, because everybody is going to see you in that way, rejecting everything. And we'll get there a lot more. We'll talk about a lot more when we get there. Oh, there's the New Roman Woman slide. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through this. So this first point we can kind of breeze past, but there's some interesting letters in history about government officials who are sending letters to subordinates and blending personal instruction with specific tasks as they enter a new role. And so we see it in a few different areas, but it's just interesting how similar some of these letters we see are to Paul's in 1 Timothy. Because Paul has some obvious personal touches throughout the letter that provides instruction for Timothy since he's young and less mature, and he's facing some really serious challenges. But Paul also provides specific tasks for Timothy to work on while in Ephesus, namely, stop the false teachers, enforce proper conduct within the church, and be an example of the Christian life. Make sure that your conduct and your teaching don't fall into this pattern of false teachers. And so he makes sure to address specific issues, such as there's angry and quarreling men who are hindering the advancement of the gospel, chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. And we've got women who are succumbing to false teaching, chapter 5, verse 15. And they're teaching it in the church, and they're disobeying the created order, chapter 2, verses 9 through 14. And so what it appears that Timothy is working with a church that is divided by loyalty and quarrels. Men quarreling with one another. Women rejecting cultural norms in such a way that portray themselves harmfully. And nobody seems to care about their image as image bearers in Ephesus. Everyone's so wrapped up in their own desires and interests that nobody wants to be a part of the church. At least that's how it's described by Paul. Nobody has, and when I say nobody, I mean these people that Paul is referencing here. I'm sure that this is not every single Christian in Ephesus here. But nobody has their hope set on the living God, chapter 4, verse 10. But rather on being right or being independent or seeking after more and better knowledge. And so that is the situation that we see in the church in Ephesus. Now, lessons for Dalreda. I think that we're going to be able to look at two big questions as we go through this study. And the first one is, how can we live as Christians in an ungodly culture? How do we combat false teaching, especially when brothers and sisters succumb to it? Now, we talked a lot about that with the 1st through 3rd John, right, in your classes in last quarter. But I think that if we're to boil it down to three things, you get focus on right doctrine, right conduct, and the household. If you're going to boil it down. Because what we see in Ephesus is that false teaching advocated for a disordered view of the whole universe. And with that, a disordered view of the church. And with that, a disordered view of the home. And by confusing all the gender roles. The church was failing to witness effectively the beauty of God's creation because they're tampering with the design. They're playing around with what they want when God designed it a certain way for a reason. And so what we have is women are abandoning the management of the household as Timothy describes it, as Paul describes it in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 14. And they're abandoning that to exercise things that Paul deems inappropriate, gossip and sexual immorality, inappropriate times and content of teaching, and usurping the authority that God has given to males in leadership. And so the order of affairs in the home and the ordering of the church's worship should reflect the work of our Creator. But they're rejecting that. How are you supposed to bring people to Christ if you're rejecting such a thing? And so the result should be this right ordering that fixes their image, chapter 6, verse 1, and the church is going to function as it should, the pillar and the buttress of truth, chapter 3, verse 15. And the second thing is going to be, what role do I play in the church? Am I filling that role? And what we're going to see, and I won't go through all of this, but what we're going to see is Paul gives specific instructions to men to stop quarreling, to women to act in a certain way and to stop doing certain things, to widows of both old and young, and how Timothy should handle both situations. We're going to get qualifications for elders and elders' wives. We're going to implicitly elders' wives. We're getting qualifications for deacons and deacons' wives. We're going to get multiple areas, and what we need to be doing as a church is, what role am I filling? Am I filling a role, first of all? And then what role am I filling? And if I am filling one of these roles, which pretty much encompasses everybody within the church, then am I doing that well? And so part of this class should also be, how are we measuring up to the qualifications and the standards that Paul has laid out and that God has laid out for us? Okay, that is all. I'm looking forward to this class. You're good to go.